our next speaker. Kenneth Graham is president of our society. He has written or edited 4 books on Shakespeare, Renaissance poetry, religion, and rhetoric. His research focuses on Shakespeare's religious language. Kenneth co-organizes the biennial Shakespearean Theatre Conference in Stratford, Ontario, and he serves on the advisory board for the new Oxford edition of George Herbert's collected works. As well, he is a proud contributor to the online Pulter project. 1 month from today will mark the completion of his 20th year at the University of Waterloo. And to Kenneth, we are all immensely indebted to this exceptionally well-designed program. His paper today is titled Pulter's End.
As anyone who's read much of it knows, Hester Pulter's poetry is obsessed with death, usually the poet's own. Here it's less clear what Pulter believes about death and why she writes about it. Her views are complicated and at times idiosyncratic, drawing on Christian, classical, and contemporary scientific understandings. Her poems seem driven by a need for emotional comfort in the face of looming death, but also by curiosity in response to the mystery it poses. Both the end of life and the ends of poetry, therefore, deserve attention in Pulter's verse. I'll pay particular attention here to the place in her poetry of what Hamlet calls the sleep of death. Some of Pulter's poems embrace a conventional dualism in which the survival of the soul provides consolation for the body's death. Poem 19, The Welcome One, is a good example. It begins with an address welcoming dear death, an event which involves nothing worse than a few sad farewells to our friends. The fear of death is foolish and its sound is sweet. The speaker acknowledges her fear only briefly in lines 8 and 9 before quickly turning to her clinching argument, death is good news for the soul because it enfranchises or frees it to fly to heaven and presumably to escape the flesh. The poem's underlying dualism then makes death a welcome visitor who liberates the soul from earthly affliction, grief, and pain. Poem 33, The Welcome To, is similar. Death is again welcomed, this time explicitly as an old friend who will end suffering. The poem is even more dismissive of the fear of death than The Welcome One. There, fear makes my flesh tremble, but here it is only young children who resist sleep, and by analogy death, while the speaker expresses unqualified assurance, I know it is my rest. In another way, however, the analogy with sleep begins to blur the picture of death. In The Welcome One, the soul's flight to heaven appears to be immediate, but in The Welcome Two, the idea of sleep introduces a 2-stage temporal progression wherein death begins a nap that lasts until the Son of Life arise in glory, a clear reference to the Last Judgment in Matthew 25:31. Only at that later time will the speaker begin a new life. This process of death, sleep, and eventual resurrection plays out in many of Pulter's poems. One of the clearest is poem 37, Aurora 2. Like the welcome poems, Aurora 2 begins with the classical figure of night, this time surrounded by her children, the black embryons of line 12, and in competition with Aurora, the goddess of the dawn. As the poem continues, however, the Christian references grow more insistent. The chaos of line 5 is common to both classical and biblical stories of origin, but the word of line 9 offers Christian comfort in response to a fear of death that is again characterized as foolish. The poem then develops the analogy hinted at in The Welcome To. If death is like a sleep, resurrection is like the return of day, following death as assuredly as day follows night. The promise of resurrection underwrites the poem's confident conclusion. Its end, like history's, is endless joy and love. However, such an account of Aurora 2 overlooks the fraught scriptural reference at its heart. Pulter's poem alludes to 1 Corinthians 15, a long, difficult chapter on death and resurrection that reads in part, "Behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. For the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall all be changed." Paul's reflections on death, sleep, and radical transformation at the last trumpet were well known, appearing in the prayer book's order for the burial of the dead. And they are central both to Pulter's poetry and on the end of life, and to the long history of Christian mortalism. Mortalist belief is usually divided into two main types: thanatopsychism, or the belief that the soul dies with the body, and psychopanicism, also known as psychosomnolence or soul sleeping, the belief that the soul enters its sleep-like state after death. Both species of mortalism hold that resurrection eventually brings a new, better life to the dead. When the Reformation's attacks on purgatory and other Catholic practices pertaining to death reopened the question of what follows death, mortalist belief itself enjoyed something of a resurrection. Luther, though cautious on this point, was open to mortalist views. "Since we call death a sleep," he wrote, "we know that we shall not long remain in it, but be again awakened and live, and that the time during which we sleep shall seem no longer than if we had just fallen asleep." But after Luther, the major Protestant reformers, including Calvin, rejected the mortalist position. And for close to a century, written English accounts consistently viewed mortalism as a radical Anabaptist belief. Only in the 1640s and 50s did mortalist belief again revive. Consistent with his monist beliefs, for example, John Milton takes a generally thanatopsychist position in his Christian doctrine, arguing that the whole person, body, soul, and spirit, dies. Throughout this history, 1 Corinthians 15 remained a key proof text for mortalism. Luther cites it, and Milton states that the reasoning proceeds from the simply mortal to the simply immortal, from death to resurrection. There is not so much as a word about any intermediate state. Indeed, Norman T. Burns notes that both Milton and his contemporary Richard Overton found the key text for Pauline mortalism in 1 Corinthians 15. Aurora, too, is one of a number of Pulter's poems that draw on 1 Corinthians 15 to suggest that the soul either sleeps or dies until the whole person is changed and given new life through resurrection. There is no indication in the poem that the soul precedes the body into heaven. Rather, the poem's logic is that the self will sleep in the grave until the general resurrection, at which time I'll mount above. But unlike 1 Corinthians 15, at least as Milton understood it, Pulter devotes a good bit of attention in her poetry to imagining an intermediate state between death and resurrection. In Aurora, too, this imagination is relatively subdued. The drowsy causes of line 17 and sleeping urns of line 19 point to a physical location for the dead while providing shorthand references to a process. For Pulter, causes are points both of origin and of termination, so they function here much like sleep, following wakefulness, but also preceding reawakening. They also suggest material causes, like the elemental dust of line 18, which here serves mainly as a biblical equivalent to causes. That is, a point of origin as well as an endpoint, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. But the nouns in line 17 and 19 are qualified by sleep and overpowered by strong verbs such as the rhyming wake and off shake, which generate a triumphal tone that is only heightened by the alliterative nouns in line 18. If contemplation of the physical dissolution suggested by dust and urns has the potential to complicate the response to death, perhaps even to weaken confidence and undermine consolation, that potential goes largely unrealized in Aurora 2. Other poems pay more attention to the intermediate state after death. The unnamed poem 47 resembles Aurora 2 in its reference to the offspring of night, named in line 25 as Erinnys, its reference to dust, and its unusual use in the final line of the word causes as a place of sleep. But while Aurora 2 focused on the moment of resurrection, poem 47 broadens the focus to include the entire process leading from death to resurrection. Its key terms are dissolution and revolution, which appear as a rhyme in both the third and the fifth stanzas. As Sarah Ross has observed, quote, Pulter's devotional musings on dissolution and revolution are both distinctive and recurrent, end quote. In this poem, they refer to a natural process. Obscurity and cheerful light after each other roll, the first and third stanzas argue, like the revolution of life and death and life. The voice of nature tells us this, as it also tells us that total nature still is kept entire. That is, nothing is lost. As Pulter writes in poem 63, employing the same rhyme that she uses in the sixth stanza of poem 47, though I to atoms am dispersed, yet shall no dust of my old carcass e'er be lost, though in 1,000 figures tossed, for thou art just. The dust just rhyme is central to poem 47's vision of the time between death and resurrection. The physical decay and dissolution that follow death don't destroy matter, but transform it. Dust is not an end, but a transitional moment, ensuring that we'll return to the life that is justly ours. What lies in the urn, Pulter might say, is not mere dust, but just dust. In poem 63, this justice belongs to God, whom the poem addresses. In poem 47, it's natural justice, and God is never mentioned. The argument draws heavily on natural philosophy, and additional references are primarily classical, Erinnys and the Fates. Is this even a Christian poem? To the extent that it is, it's made so by its reference in the second stanza to one of the best known parts of 1 Corinthians 15. Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? But the placement of this reference near the start of the poem differs significantly from the placement of the similar reference in Aurora 2. There, the ultimate victory of resurrection appears in the middle of the poem to dispel the confused chaos created by night and her grotesque brood. Its appearance generates momentum that carries the poem to its conclusion, enacting victory and offering strong comfort. In contrast, poem 47's declaration of victory is followed by the poem's investigation of dissolution, dust, and death. The result is a poem that is more tonally complex. How should we read this complexity? One possibility is to see it as undercutting the comfort that Aurora 2 and the Welcome poems aim to create. Leah Knight and Wendy Wall take this position, commenting that, quote, the speaker soothes her saddened soul, but the proffered solace might seem cold comfort since it requires the embrace of death. The poem's incongruous final image, they add, likening that grave to her finest downy bed, revives some of the disquiet of the opening scene, end quote. But if requiring the embrace of death offers cold comfort, and if the grave cannot be compared positively to a bed in which all sleep best, much of Pulter's poetic project is doomed to fail, since one of its chief ends is to make that embrace and that bed or cause welcome, or at least less frightening. Another possibility is to see the poem's insistent logic, easily visible in the fours that begin the second, fifth, and eighth stanzas, and the thens in the sixth and seventh, as successful. In this reading, Pulter presents her knockdown biblical argument first, and the guarantee of ultimate victory creates a safe space for the argument about process that follows. Pulter is free to explore the voice of nature because its potentially frightening processes of dissolution have already been shown to be a halfway house on the road to a revolution that is entirely consistent with the Word of God. Read this way, the poem is not less comforting than Aurora 2, but only more experimental. This difference can also be seen in 47's form. The stanza form, a cross-rhymed quatrain with alternating iambic pentameter and iambic trimeter lines, is unusual anywhere and unique in Pulter's oeuvre. The welcome poems in Aurora 2, like the majority of Pulter's poems, are written in more conventional pentameter couplets. Pulter makes expert use of her experimental form to convey the sense of both change and recurrence, and of both delay and resolution. The dissolution-revolution rhyme, for instance, first appears as the A rhyme, then its order reversed as the B rhyme. The alternation of long and short lines mimics the process of revolution that the poem explores. The long lines stretch out like time itself, while the short lines offer brief, emphatic resolutions. Oh, happy victory, to come and do me right, in all her actions just, in causes all sleep best. What is most striking about poem 47 then is how it combines experimental form and unorthodox content with the same purpose of reassurance that is the end of more conventional poems. This combination is also illustrated by poem 40, which goes further into heterodox opinions by exploring not only rolling revolution, but also the transmigration of souls. The Christian frame of reference is again present, but unobtrusive. Instead, stanzas 5 through 8 entertain a number of possible intermediate future states without claiming to know which is most likely. Indeed, the uncertainty appears to be the point. It doesn't matter when you dissolve into your elements, which element you most increase. It doesn't matter whether you become a lamb or a dove, or if you transmigrate or simply revolve. The uncertainty signaled by whether and if dominates the middle of the poem, yet causes no anxiety because salvation is assured. What precedes salvation ends, but the joys that follow are endless. Here I agree completely with Knight and Wall, who see comfort in the promise of a future radical change in metamorphosis as both a religious and a poetic principle. Poem 40's ballad form, his ballad stanza, is unique in Pulter's work. For her, the form is radically experimental. Yet it's also the most common form in early modern popular poetry, and through the best-selling state-authorized Whole Book of Psalms, the most common poetic measure in early modern religious worship. She uses it for purposes of exploration, secure in the knowledge that the explorer will return safely home. If these poems finally demonstrate the compatibility of comfort and a heterodox belief, it's fitting that poem 40 offers some of the strongest evidence of Pulter's possible mortalism, opening with an address to my soul before imploring whomever or whatever is being addressed in line 13 not to lament thy mortal nature. For while the opponents of mortalism complained that it was an uncomfortable doctrine, Luther and others argued the opposite. The scriptures assure us, wrote Luther, that in death we, quote, rest sweetly and gently for a brief moment as on a sofa, until the time when he shall call and awaken us together with all his dear children to his eternal glory and joy. For Pulter, as for Luther, mortalism functions not as a dogma, but as a possibility, a space of both uncertainty and freedom in which her mind, free as my verse, could wander and wonder at the incomprehensible ways of God, including the mysteries of death and resurrection. Faith and speculation fueled by ignorance both play a part in Pulter's poetic project. As she wrote in one of her final poems, that God that can annihilate this all and it is nothing recreate, even he that has supported me till now, to whom my soul doth pray and humbly bow, will raise me unto life, I know not how. Here a profession of faith is followed by a confession of ignorance, but the two serve the same end. If resurrection depended on her knowledge, it would never happen. It's the how, the process, that is uncertain. But that very uncertainty is part of an explorative freedom that itself arises from a comforting faith that God has determined the final outcome. It's the juxtaposition of comfort and speculation that characterizes Pulter's poetry on death and defines her end. Thanks.